It began without ceremony, without omen, without even the faintest tremor to herald the death of the universe's oldest chorus. One heartbeat, the warp howled with its eternal madness, its tides gnawing at reality like starving beasts. The next, it simply stopped. Across the galaxy, the sudden absence fell like a phantom blade, severing every psychic thread that bound the Imperium together. Astropaths collapsed mid-chant, their mouths open in silent screams as the pain of disconnection tore through nerves crafted for a lifetime of communion with the Immaterium. Choir pits, once blazing with violet fire, became mausoleums of extinguished souls, their death throes echoing in cold stone chambers, still heavy with incense and the residue of burnt sanctity. Void ships drifting through the starless dark lurched as their Geller fields flickered, then stabilized in a manner no one understood. There were no demons clawing at the periphery, no whisper of the Immaterium brushing against the barrier of real space. It was as though the warp had been scooped clean from existence, leaving captains staring at Auspex readings that showed nothing. No roiling storms, no predatory shadows, no distant psychic signatures. Only empty, lightless silence. And silence, in the 41st millennium, was never salvation. It was a warning. On a remote listening station orbiting the desolate moon of Cathalon Secundus, a lone astropath crawled toward the Vox altar, blood trailing in thick strands from her eyes where psychic flame had once burned. Blind now, she pressed her trembling hand to the cold brass surface and felt nothing. No pulse of the Astronomicon, no divine resonance of the Emperor's everlasting beacon. The void felt hollow, stripped of its soul. Her last breath left her as a whisper, not of fear, but of incomprehension. The same question forming in thousands of dying minds across the Imperium. How can the warp be gone? On 100 hive worlds, sanctioned psychers clutched their skulls as the sudden stillness suffocated them. Their existence had always been defined by the constant weight of the Immaterium pressing against their thoughts, tempting, tormenting, testing. Now, bereft of that pressure, they felt as though their minds were suspended above an abyss, unable to anchor themselves to anything familiar. Enforcers dragged them away in chains, not out of discipline but confusion. Unable to fathom why these dangerous beings were suddenly powerless, trembling, and terrified for reasons they could not articulate. In the Cathedra of San Mornival, deep within the Segmentum Solar, Cardinal Helbrecht stood before the towering icon of the Emperor Ascendant. Flickering candles cast wavering shadows across his ancient features as he listened for the familiar psychic hum that had always pulsed at the edges of his consciousness, faint yet ever present. It was gone. All that remained was a dead hush that felt sacrilegious in its purity. His rosarius trembled in his grasp as he realized he could not sense the Astronomicon, could not feel the distant chorus of the ecclesiarchy's soul-bonded faithful. The silence felt like abandonment, like the first breath after drowning, only to find the air poisoned. But nowhere was the terror more profound than upon terror itself. Deep beneath the adamantine vaults of the Imperial Palace, the Adeptus Custodes halted mid-stride as they felt something rupture. Not in the air, but in the immaterial fabric they had sensed every day of their lives. The psychic glow emanating from the golden throne flickered like a candle's dying flame. No alarm sounded, no klaxons wailed. Yet every warrior in that sacred hall felt the same. Impossible truth crystallized in the marrow of his bones. The Emperor's light had dimmed, not weakened, not strained. Dimmed, as though it were retreating into a place where even his eternal radiance could not penetrate. On the throne itself, The Emperor's body sat unchanged, skeletal and motionless, but the vast psychic storm that had surrounded him for 10,000 years had collapsed into a tight, suffocating sphere. Tech priests attending the ancient machinery panicked as runes turned black. Power readings dipped erratically, and the throne's conduits vibrated with an unfamiliar, almost resentful energy. They shouted litanies of maintenance and hammered sacred codes into their consoles, yet none dared approach the God Emperor directly. Even in decay, he radiated authority. Even weakened, he was a force that dwarfed all comprehension. Somewhere within that failing sphere, a spark flickered, brief, violent, like a heartbeat echoing through eternity. On the outer walls of the palace, storm shields dimmed, lightning barriers stuttered, and psychers within the Astra Telepathica shrieked as whatever vestige of their connection remained was severed entirely. Terror, the eternal center of human civilization, suddenly felt smaller, colder, more mortal. News from the stars ceased instantly. The Imperium had been thrust into a darkness it had not known since the age of strife. Across the galaxy, captains, governors, inquisitors, and warlords demanded answers that no one could provide. Vox channels erupted into chaos as fleets realized they could no longer navigate through real space with any certainty. Warp drives lay dormant like dead hearts. Navigators clutched at their sockets, finding their third eyes blind to all but the mundane fabric of reality. The Imperium, for a fleeting moment, was a creature whose veins had been emptied, stumbling without the lifeblood that had sustained it since its birth. For 20 minutes, the galaxy lay still. Then, in the far reaches of Ultima Segmentum, a sensor array detected a faint gravitational distortion, an anomaly that did not originate from the warp, but from the very structure of real space. It pulsed once, twice, then vanished. Its nature was unknown, but the timing was unmistakable. The warp had not died by accident. Something had done this, and as the Imperium reeled from the silence, as the first hour of the impossible dawned, a deeper, more terrible question stretched across the stars. If the warp was gone, what was awakening in its place? The first hour of the warp's disappearance rippled across the Imperium like a wound torn through reality, but nowhere did its consequences cut deeper than on Holy Terror itself. The echoes of the Astronomican's collapse lingered in the air, like the fading toll of a celestial bell, a vibration that only psychers and the soul-sensitive could perceive. It felt as though the very atmosphere had been hollowed, leaving a cold stillness that unsettled even those who had never known the warp's touch. Within the imperial palace, thousands of attendants, scribes, and warriors moved with forced purpose, their disciplined steps masking the dread they could not ignore. Something was wrong, profoundly and cosmically wrong, and terror felt smaller beneath that realization. The Adeptus Custodes marched through the sanctum corridors with their usual precision, yet every golden-clad guardian sensed the shift that had taken place beyond mortal perception. For 10,000 years they had lived in the presence of the Emperor's psychic radiance. A constant storm of divinity pressed against the edges of their awareness. Now that radiance was condensed, drawn inward, its absence around them almost painful. The silence felt like a scream swallowed before utterance, and though none spoke of it aloud, each custodian tightened his grip on his guardian spear, as if bracing against an invisible onslaught. In the tower of Heliopause, the astral cartographers of terror stared at dead screens and blank hololiths. Their sacred instruments, devices calibrated to trace the Astronomican's beam across the stars, displayed nothing but static. The beam that once carved a golden scar through the abyss was extinguished. No sermons, no rituals, no act of faith could reignite the map of the galaxy that had guided humanity for millennia. The chief cartographer, an old man whose eyes had long since turned milky from decades of exposure to the beam's reflected light, trembled as he reached out to touch the inert projection. He felt only cold glass. The knowledge broke something inside him. Elsewhere in the palace, the Imperial Senate erupted into discord. High Lords argued in hushed but urgent tones, their whispers sharp with panic they dared not voice openly. For generations they had clung to the illusion of control, convinced they could steer the Imperium through its endless storms. But this was different. This was the death of the one thing that made the Imperium possible. Whispers spread that the Emperor had weakened, that the throne was failing, that the galaxy now spiraled toward a darkness even the age of strife could not match. No one dared speak these fears beyond the Senate chambers, yet the weight of unspoken dread pressed harder with each passing minute. Deep in the labyrinth beneath the Eternity Gate, the Sisters of Silence knelt in silent formation. Their null aura, once a small defiance against the warp's tyranny, now felt strangely hollow. Their leader, the Oblivion Matriarch, sensed the absence as keenly as a missing limb. She did not fear this emptiness. No sister ever feared the void, but she recognized its unnatural nature. The warp had not merely quieted, it had recoiled. The matriarch rose, her expression unreadable, and signaled for her warriors to prepare. Something was unfolding that required their vigilance. At the heart of the palace, the Adeptus Mechanicus struggled to interpret what their rune readers insisted was impossible. The Golden Throne's power signatures fluctuated in patterns unseen since the early days of its construction. The great machine was not failing, it was resisting. Massive cables trembled with restrained energy. Conduits pulsed as though struggling to contain an unseen force. And ancient wards flickered with ghost light. Tech priests chanted Binharic hymns in rapid desperation, desperately attempting to align their readings with logic. But logic had abandoned them. Something within the throne was moving. The Emperor's presence, normally endless and overwhelming, now felt compressed into a single, seething point. Psychers across Terra collapsed in droves, some writhing, others eerily still, their minds unable to comprehend the altered nature of his radiance. Among them was Astropath Miranta, who in her final moments discerned a faint thread within the emptiness. A pulse, irregular yet deliberate, like a distant heartbeat echoing across aeons. Her lips parted in revelation before death claimed her. It was not the warp she had sensed. It was something beneath it or beyond it. In the outer districts of the palace, the Imperial Fist successor legionaries, stationed as ceremonial honor guards, felt their gene seat stir in response to the Emperor's shifting presence. Even they, engineered to withstand horrors, felt unease settle in their bones. Chaplains recited litanies of endurance, reassuring their warriors that faith would carry them through the night. But the words felt thin, fragile, like parchment pressed against a storm. Above the palace, the sky darkened as Terra's upper atmosphere reacted to the subtle turbulence of real space. Clouds gathered unnaturally fast, swirling in patterns that priests attempted to interpret as omens. Thunder rolled, slow and heavy, as if some primal force beneath the crust of the world shifted in its ancient slumber. The first hour passed, then the second, each moment marked by an oppressive stillness that grew heavier rather than fading. Vox channels crackled with frantic reports from the segmentum solar. Fleets stranded, worlds cut off, psychic choirs dead or dying. Terror, became the anchor, yet it too drifted helplessly in the dark. In the throne room, the custodes formed a silent circle around their eternal lord, waiting for a sign, a command, a revelation. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity before the air trembled, faint but undeniable. A low resonance pulsed outward from the golden throne, vibrating the stones beneath their feet. It was not the Emperor's usual radiance, nor was it a fluctuation of failing systems. It was a breath. The Emperor had moved, but whether this was resurgence, warning, or the prelude to an unimaginable catastrophe, none could yet know. Only one truth settled through the chamber like falling ash. The warp was gone, and the master of mankind was waking to a galaxy suddenly, terrifyingly silent. Across the cold vastness of the segmentum solar, the consequences of Terra's silence unfolded with relentless clarity. The moment the Astronomicon vanished, thousands of Imperial vessels drifting through the void felt the change as palpably as a sudden intake of breath. Warp drives, deprived of their connection to the Imperium, did not explode or rupture. Instead, they fell into a dormant stillness, like organs that had ceased beating but had not yet decayed. Geller fields hummed with no purpose, their shimmering barriers protecting ships from a realm that no longer existed. It was this unnatural calm, more than any mechanical failure, that unsettled every soul adrift in the void. Aboard Battlefleet Solar's flagship, the Gloria Invictus, Admiral Rathan Varro stood before the command lectern, staring at dead psychic readings that refused to shift. His navigators sat in a silent semicircle, their third eyes covered, their expressions blank. They were not writhing in pain, nor babbling prophecies, nor clawing at their skulls. Their minds were empty. Every navigator across the fleet felt the same hollowness, a sudden absence of tides they had spent lifetimes reading. Varro had faced tyrannid incursions, chaos warbands and heretic uprisings, but nothing in his decades of command had prepared him for this paralysis. The fleet was not under attack, yet it was dying all the same. He ordered status reports from every vessel under his command, and the answer came back uniform and bleak. Real space engines remained functional, but they offered little hope. Traversing the Imperium without the warp was equivalent to asking a mortal to cross an ocean by crawling along the seabed. Battleships capable of tearing through demonic storms could not outmaneuver the limits of mundane propulsion. They were trapped, marooned between stars that suddenly felt impossibly distant. Crew members clung to their duties with the discipline hammered into them by lifetimes of indoctrination. They performed rites of machine appeasement, recited the canticles of function, and prayed to the god Emperor for signs of deliverance. But the litanies sounded brittle in the metallic corridors, their echoes swallowed by the oppressive quiet that seemed to spread through the ship itself. Even the engine's steady vibration felt diminished, as though the vessel sensed the severance from the universe it had always relied upon. In the Gloria Invictus's strategium, holoscreens flickered with stuttering projections of nearby systems. Without the Astronomicon's beam, the star maps appeared faint and uncertain, lacking the golden axis that had once illuminated every navigational chart. A junior officer stepped forward, his voice steady but fragile, and informed Admiral Varro that astropathic communication remained impossible. The last message received before the silence had been a fragment of psychic agony from Terra, abruptly severed. No further signals had followed. Varro dismissed the officer and turned his gaze to the observation viewport. The stars drifted slowly across the frame, glittering with indifferent calm. They had not changed, yet the galaxy felt alien. The Imperium had always relied on the warp to bind its fractured domains together. Now that binding had unraveled, leaving every captain, every soldier, every world isolated. The sheer scale of it was unthinkable. Humanity was no longer a unified empire. It was a scattering of candles left to burn alone in an immeasurable night. On the fleet's outer perimeter, escort frigates repositioned themselves in tight defensive formations, their crews acting out of instinct rather than strategy. Without warp sensors, without astropathic warnings, without psychic auguries, the Imperium's ships were blind. The void was vast, and though the warp was gone, the threats of real space remained. Xenos raiders, pirate vessels, and malignant anomalies still lurked in the dark. The fleet could not risk a vulnerability, not now, not when the galaxy itself felt poised to shift. On the Gloria Invictus, Navigator Lord Hesperian finally broke his silence. He approached Varro, his gait unsteady, his voice strained with an unfamiliar vulnerability. For the first time in his life, he confessed that he could see nothing. No currents, no storms, no whisper of the Astronomican's light. He felt like a man whose eyes had been gouged out, forced to navigate a world he could no longer perceive. Yet he insisted the emptiness itself was not natural. It was shaped, deliberate, as if something immense had swept its hand across the immaterium and smoothed it into nothingness. Before Varro could respond, alarms blared across the bridge. Officers scrambled to their stations, shouting overlapping reports. A massive energy distortion had appeared on the fleet's long-range auspex, its signature unlike any anomaly recorded in Imperial archives. It pulsed rhythmically, swelling and collapsing with steady precision. The intensity of the readings suggested a gravitational ripple, yet the void around it remained undisturbed by mass or movement. Varro ordered all ships to maintain distance. The distortion was distant, light years away, but its pattern was unmistakably artificial. It resembled a signal, a beacon, or perhaps a resonance wave. But no, human technology could create such an effect, and no Xenos species known to the Imperium possessed the capability to manipulate gravity with such precision. The fleet's tech priest chanted warnings of forbidden science, of relics from the dark age of technology, of cosmic phenomena that should not exist. The distortion pulsed again. This time it was stronger, and in the hollow silence where the warp once raged, the fleet felt the tremor ripple across real space, like a whispered message carried on the breath of the void. Admiral Varro stared into the shifting anomaly, and a single, chilling certainty formed in his mind. The warp had not simply vanished. Something was calling through the dark, and whatever had silenced the galaxy was not yet finished. The ripple that brushed against Battlefleet Solar's hull spread far beyond its charts, carrying its silent tremor toward the fortress world that had once stood as the Imperium's immortal bulwark. Cadia, reforged through decades of brutal reconstruction, lay beneath a sky unusually clear. The ruins of the old pylons had long since been resurrected into monoliths of black stone and adamantine, taller and more complex than before, their surfaces etched with runes whose meanings only a handful of sanctioned scholars dared contemplate. For years, the people of this reborn world had lived with the ceaseless glare of the Eye of Terror overhead, boiling, writhing, a hole in reality that screamed across their nights. But today, the eye was still. Lord Castellan Varix Holt stood on the command balcony of Casarvalas, staring at the shimmering auroras that draped the sky. They should have twisted with warp light, pulsing in grotesque rhythms. Instead, they drifted slowly, like painted veils stirred by a breath. His officers murmured nervously behind him, whispering the questions none wished to speak aloud. How could the eye of terror, source of horror, gateway of demons, soul wound of the galaxy, be calm? The absence of its storms was not comforting. It felt like standing beside a chained beast whose growling had abruptly ceased, leaving only the weight of its unblinking stare. Reports streamed into the strategium, each more unsettling than the last. Vox channels that once crackled with background warp static were eerily clean. Long-range Auspex readings showed stable star patterns where there should have been distortions. Even the ancient sensors embedded in the pylon's foundations registered a complete absence of psychic pressure. The eye had not closed. The colossal rift was still visible in the sky, but its surface was motionless, no longer boiling with colors that should not exist. It looked less like a screaming wound, and more like a frozen image of itself, as though trapped beneath an invisible layer of ice. Holt's adjutant, Lieutenant Gravan, approached with a data slate trembling in his hands. Holt took it silently, scanning the readings with growing dread. The pylon network, ancient and half understood even by the Mechanicus, was resonating, not in reaction to the eye, but in response to some distant pulse. Their harmonic patterns shifted with every echo of the ripple that had passed through real space. As the cadence repeated, the pylon's resonance deepened, forming a pattern eerily similar to the readings intercepted by Battlefleet Solar. Something was speaking to the galaxy, though its message remained locked behind incomprehensible frequencies. A thunderous vibration rumbled through the fortress. For a heartbeat, the Cadians braced for bombardment, but the tremor came from beneath them, from the colossal pylons themselves. Their surfaces brightened with faint illumination, thin streams of pale energy pulsing along deep-cut channels like blood vessels awakening. Tech priests swarmed the control stations, chanting in alarm as they attempted to override systems older than the Imperium itself. Holt watched the runes flare brighter, their glow casting sharp shadows across the snow-dusted battlements. Every instinct he possessed warned him that these lights were not a sign of protection. On the plains beyond Casa Valas, soldiers halted mid-drill as the distant monoliths flared in synchronized flashes. The ground shuddered, dislodging frost that drifted like ash. Veterans who had survived the fall of Cadia tightened their grips on their laser guns, memories of the world's previous death whispering in their minds. They had rebuilt their home upon its own corpse, steeled themselves against the eye's tyranny, and sworn that Cadia would never fall again. Yet, as the pylons pulsed with long-dormant power, even the hardest of them felt an unease that no discipline could smother. In the command balcony, a series of low chimes emanated from the Mechanicus consoles. Holt turned sharply as the tech priests delivered their translation of the pylon resonance. It was not a weapon activation, nor a defensive shield, nor a breach of containment. The pylons were aligning. Something across the galaxy was harmonizing with them, as if calling out to every structure tuned to the frequencies of old galactic scars. The pylons were answering, though with what intent no mortal could say. Before Holt could issue new orders, the sky flickered. The eye of terror darkened, not with shadow, but with an absence of corruption. The swirling madness receded, colors draining into a uniform, unnatural stillness. It was like watching a storm freeze in place, its cyclonic fury held in suspension. Every soldier on Cadia turned their eyes upward, breath locked in their throats. The eye had not healed, but it had fallen silent, stripped of its roiling hatred. It loomed above them like a colossal god staring back without emotion. A soft hum rippled across the world, brushing against every living mind. Even the least sensitive among the population felt a faint vibration at the base of their skulls, like a distant echo of thought or memory. It was gone in an instant, yet its impact lingered. Holt exhaled slowly, realizing that whatever force had silenced the warp had touched Cadia in a far more intimate manner. The eye was not merely dormant, it was listening. As the pylon lights dimmed, a final pulse surged outward, faint but deliberate, as though marking the end of a conversation spoken across epochs. Holt felt the chill of realization creep across his skin. Cadia had not been spared the silence. It had been chosen by it. Beneath the stillness that had swept across Cadia, deeper than the frozen calm of the eye itself, an older awareness stirred. The ripple that had brushed the fortress world did not vanish into the void. It continued onward, traveling in perfect silence through the black between stars until it reached the ancient tomb realms where no heartbeat sounded, no breath stirred dust, and no mortal had walked in 1,000,000 years. There, among labyrinthine vaults carved from living metal, the galaxy's most patient watchers opened their eyes. On the lifeless surface of Solemnis, the first tremor passed through the obsidian sand with such subtlety that no organic creature could have perceived it. But the Necron structures buried beneath felt it immediately. Countless filaments of living necrodermis vibrated with unnatural resonance, awakening protocols so deeply interred within their systems that even their cryptex had long forgotten them. In chambers lit by emerald flame, stasis vaults flickered, their geometries shifting with mathematical precision. Sarcophagi slid open without sound, releasing figures of burnished metal whose green cores glowed brighter with each passing second. In the vaulted throne hall of the Nihilak dynasty, Overlord Zekanur emerged from stasis, his noble form gleaming with cold perfection. His eyes burned with twin emerald fires as his systems completed their reawakening sequence. He did not question why he had been revived. Necron minds did not grasp for answers as mortals did. Instead, he analyzed the data streams flowing through the dynastic network. Every diagnostic returned the same impossible truth. The warp had fallen silent. For a species that despised the Imperium, this should have been an event of triumph. Yet the stillness that filled the void was not the clean severance they sought. It was a manufactured absence, a deliberate suppression, that made it a threat. Zekanur strode across the hall, each step resonating through the metal floors like a tolling bell. At his approach, the cryptex knelt, their wiry frames humming with energy as they processed the cosmic disturbance. They presented their findings, graphs of gravitational distortions, harmonic disruptions, and a peculiar pattern of cascading pulses. All pointed toward the same origin as the pylon resonances on Cadia, a frequency older than any current star, older even than the time before the war in heaven. Zekan-Ur recognized it. It was the faint echo of the technology the Necrons had once used to imprison the Cetan shards. Except this pulse did not resemble entombment. It resembled awakening. As he processed this revelation, a deeper tremor shuddered through Solemnis, stronger than the first. Monolithic spires once buried beneath the planet's surface erupted from the ground in perfect alignment, their surfaces shifting like liquid metal forming new sigils. The Necrons watched without expression as hieroglyphs encoded with ancient commands pulsed with emerald light. It was a message from the oldest protocols of their empire, instructions written before the dynasty's records even began. Across the galaxy, other tomb worlds reacted in perfect synchrony. On Mandragora, megastructures older than Terra's continents unfolded from hibernation. The Sautek dynasty's phalanxes activated with chilling precision, their overlords rising from their thrones as data streams confirmed a universal truth. The galaxy had entered a state of deviation unprecedented since the Necron biotransference. The Imperium, long their hated nemesis, had been silenced by an unknown force. The Sautek did not celebrate. Their calculations indicated a danger even they could not quantify. Far from the dynasty's strongholds, in the deepest vaults of a nameless tomb world long believed inert, a being more ancient than most stars opened its eyes. Its frame, unlike the uniform bodies of the common Necron, was carved with runes of power predating even the Citan's rebellion. Its consciousness flickered like a dying star reigniting. It sat motionless for a long moment, processing its rediscovered existence. When it finally rose from its obsidian throne, the tomb world itself trembled. This was no mere overlord. This was a silent king's hand-constructed archivist, a remnant of the Triarch, designed to awaken only when the galaxy reached a condition described by ancient prophecy. The archivist lifted its staff, and a cascade of holographic star charts materialized around it. Maps of the galaxy as it had once been, as it was now, and as it would be under calculated probabilities. The current state confounded all projections. The suppression of the warp had created a void so absolute it disrupted even Necron predictive algorithms. In its cold and flawless logic, only one conclusion formed. Something was attempting to reshape the galaxy into a state where the warp no longer held dominion, a state the Necrons had once sought but abandoned. The archivist transmitted its findings across all awakened tomb worlds, its voice echoing through frequencies no mortal ear could hear. On Solemnes, Zekanur received the transmission. His core flared in acknowledgement. The cryptex around him immediately began recalibrating the dynasty's dolmen gates, using the new signal to triangulate the source of the cosmic pulse. Their calculations pointed toward a region of space that had long been avoided, even by the Necrons. A region deformed by an artifact of impossible scale, an origin, one abandoned by all sane factions of the galaxy. The pulse had come from the edge of the halo stars. For the first time in countless millennia, Zekanur felt something akin to disquiet. Not fear, Necrons did not fear, but anticipation sharpened with the razor edge of consequence. The galaxy was shifting. Whatever force had silenced the warp was powerful enough to shake Necron stasis protocols awake. He raised his staff, issuing commands that resonated across the tomb world. Legions stirred, war engines activated, the dynasties prepared. The warp was gone, and something older than chaos had begun to wake. While the Necron dynasties awakened to calculation and cold purpose, far beyond the Imperium's scattered borders, another silence spread, one that struck at a species whose existence depended upon the warp's endless tides. Deep within the void between galaxies, where light faltered and hunger reigned eternal, the great hive fleets drifted in slow, deliberate patterns. These leviathans, each a world-sized organism, pulsed with synaptic life. Their consciousness was not individual but woven, a single, immeasurable mind linking billions of creatures through psychic strands that reached across impossible distances. And then those strands snapped. It happened without warning. One moment, the hive mind stretched its awareness like a vast net through the immaterium, tasting distant galaxies, tracking prey with perfect clarity. The next, the net collapsed into darkness so complete It resembled death. Psychic links failed in cascading waves, rippling through every brood, every ship organism, every hive cluster. The shock was instantaneous and devastating. For a race that communicated through the warp as naturally as humans breathed air, the sudden void was a suffocating nightmare. On the edges of the Milky Way, Hive Fleet Cronus twitched violently as its synaptic conduits overloaded. Warriors staggered mid-motion, their limbs spasming while their minds reeled in disoriented frenzy. Broodlords clutched their claws against their chests, keening in low, guttural screeches that vibrated through the bioship's living hulls. Even the monstrous Norn Queens, whose intellects formed the core of each fleet's identity, faltered. Their neural lobes throbbed as they attempted to re-establish contact with the hive mind, only to find emptiness where once an ocean of thought had surged. The void was not merely silence. It was absence, unnatural and unnerving. The hive mind had not died. Every instinct screamed that its core still existed, but its presence was distant, unreachable, as if a wall had been erected between the Tyranids and the psychic realm that empowered them. Within the flagship organism of Hive Fleet Cronus, a Norn Queen slithered through the amniotic depths of her gestation chambers, her massive form trembling with agitation. Her synaptic tendrils groped outward, desperately seeking the guiding pulse of the greater consciousness. When the answer did not come, she emitted a tremor that carried through every chamber of the bioship. Instantly, the surrounding gaunts and warriors stilled, not in discipline, but in confusion, their minds void of the comforting presence that shaped their every instinct. Across thousands of vessels, the same paralysis unfolded. Tyranids existed to consume, adapt, evolve, but without the hive mind's direction, they were something lesser, still dangerous, still lethal, but fragmented. The Tyranid gestalt had always been greater than the sum of its parts. Now the parts remained, confused and restless, while the greater whole hovered just beyond their grasp. In the black gulf between stars, the enormous tendrils of a hive ship reached outward, tasting the cosmic winds. Normally, psychic currents flowed through these tendrils like nutrients, guiding and informing the fleet. Now they found nothing. No taste, no scent, no ripple of thought. The ship shuddered, its massive plates vibrating as it tried to comprehend what it was sensing. A primal unease spread through its organic structure. For creatures born from hunger and driven by unyielding instinct, confusion was a rare and dangerous state. But the silence did not last. After long minutes of drifting uncertainty, a faint echo brushed against the fleet's consciousness, a single pulse, weak but unmistakably real space in origin. The Norn Queens detected it simultaneously, lifting their heads in unison. Not a warp signal, not a psychic whisper, something else, something physical, carried through the void by gravitational waves and the subtle distortions of stellar movement. It was the same ripple that had awakened the Necrons. Though diminished nearly to nothing over such distance, its pattern was clear, a frequency shaped by intention rather than chance. The Norn Queens processed it, analyzing the rhythm with rapid neurological firing. It did not resemble prey signature, nor territorial threat, nor stellar anomaly. It was something utterly alien. Yet its calculated nature made one truth inescapable. Whatever had silenced the warp was not a natural occurrence. The Tyranids were living weapons crafted by a cosmic will, not mindless beasts, but a species guided by the cold mathematics of survival. They adapted without hesitation, reshaping themselves to overcome any obstacle. And so, in the absence of the warp, the biofleets began to reconfigure. Not individually, but collectively. guided by a residual fragment of the hive mind that still resonated within their cores like a distant heartbeat. Synaptic creatures lined their spines with new neural filaments. Spore chimneys altered the chemical composition of their vapors. Warriors grew secondary brain clusters, crude but functional. The fleets were evolving toward a state in which communication could flow through real space itself. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to maintain cohesion. Each shift was subtle, inefficient, but necessary. This hive mind had once traversed the warp, with the effortless grace of a leviathan swimming through tides. Now it attempted to scrape its claws across the cold metal of reality without its natural medium. The Norn Queen of Cronus extended a single synaptic tendril through a nerve pillar, channeling her first coherent thought since the silence. A command, faint but determined: adapt. The pulse was repeated by other queens, carried across residual links that flickered weakly but held. Evolution accelerated. Fleets across the galaxy stirred from paralysis, driven by instinct sharpened into urgency. The silence itself had become prey, a mystery that had to be consumed, understood, and dismantled. For the Tyranids feared nothing, but they recognized opportunity. If the warp remained dead, the galaxy would be laid bare before them. If something had killed it, that something might be prey of unimaginable value. And so the fleets turned their colossal forms toward the pulse. The galaxy had changed, and hunger followed. Across the distant star paths, where the craft worlds drifted like shattered memories of a once great empire, the Eldar felt the death of the warp more intimately than any species still clinging to flesh. For them, the Imperium was not merely a medium of travel or power. It was a wound they carried in their souls, a prison of their own making, and a constant reminder of a god born from their sins. When the warp fell silent, every Eldar, from warlock to guardian, from exodite wanderer to the most ancient farseer, felt the shock ripple through the infinity circuits like a tremor of cosmic grief. On the immense craft world Ulthwé, suspended in the shadowed edges of the Eye of Terror, Farseer Lirael stood motionless on the crystalline balcony of the Dome of Crystal Seers. She did not need to touch the runes floating around her in slow orbit to know they were darkened. The threads of fate, normally tangled with warp light, now hung dull and inert, like strands of dead hair. Her breath caught as she reached into the skein once more, forcing her mind through the emptiness. She found nothing, no visions, no futures, no half-formed whispers. The warp had not retreated. It had ceased to exist as a realm of thought and emotion. Around her, the preserved forms of ancient seers flickered with pulses of faint light. These were the Eldar who had given themselves to the infinity circuit centuries ago, their souls held in quiet communion to guide the living. Now their glow was dimmer than it had ever been. Lirael felt panic threaten the edges of her disciplined mind. If the infinity circuits lost their connection to the psychic realm, if the souls within were trapped in a silent void, then death for her people would become a prison with no hope of rebirth. A gentle step sounded behind her. Eldrad Ulthran, oldest and greatest of all living farsers, approached with a staff that hummed softly against the crystalline floor. His eyes, ancient and wise, reflected an emotion seldom seen among their kind: uncertainty. "You feel it," he said quietly, though it was not a question. "The wound is sealed, yet the scar remains." Lirael bowed her head. "The skein has vanished. Every possibility is locked away from me. I cannot see 1 hour into the path ahead." Her voice trembled, though she fought to still it. "Is this how humanity feels? blind, mute. Eldrad lifted a rune between his fingers and let it drift into the air, but it responded sluggishly, its glow flickering like a dying flame. "This is worse than blindness," he murmured. "This is the absence of destiny." Before Lirael could respond, a shockwave rippled through the dome, making the crystalline walls vibrate like a living harp. Both farces turned toward the sky. The Eye of Terror, Ulthway's eternal torment, was visible through the shielding domes. It should have roiled with cursed colours, should have screamed with the rage of demons and the lust of gods. Instead, it lay still, a vast swirling brew suspended in absolute silence. Lirael's breath tightened. "Is the great enemy gone?" "No," Eldrad whispered. "It is watching." Other craft worlds felt the same dread. On Biel-Tan, exarchs of the aspect shrines halted mid-ritual, their war masks humming in confusion as the psychic echoes of Cain's wrath faded from their veins. The warriors found themselves hollow, cut off from the fire that guided their martial spirits. Some tore at their armor in desperation. Others knelt in silence, unwilling to trust the stillness that pressed against their thoughts. On Eanden, the spirit seers trembled as the infinity circuit's harmony wavered. The dead stirred within their wraithbone shells, not from unrest but from fear. A wraithlord paused mid-step, turning its helmeted head toward a sky no longer whispering with warp winds. Its gesture was slow, uncertain, as though seeking direction from a voice it could no longer hear. Everywhere, the Eldar felt the same truth. The realm of souls had gone silent. Eldrad called the Council of Seers with urgency unseen since the fall. In the grand chamber of scrying, the assembled farcers floated in meditative stances, yet none could pierce the skein. They listened instead to the faint hum of their runes, searching for patterns in the stillness. After long minutes, a single rune flickered across Eldrad's staff, a signal, faint yet deliberate. A message, not from the warp, but from real space itself. A pulse of gravity, a tremor of starlight. The same cosmic ripple felt by Cadia, Battlefleet Solar, and the Necron tomb worlds. Lirael gasped as her rune circle stirred, not with visions, but with vibrations echoing the same frequency. "This is not chaos," she whispered. "This is something older." Eldrad closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw not images but impressions, a sense of immensity, of intention, of something shifting across the galaxy, with purpose so vast even the old ones had feared it. "The warp has been silenced," he said, voice low. "Not destroyed, not wounded, silenced, as if forced into submission." A murmur rippled through the council. Some farcers recoiled in disbelief. Others felt cold dread settle in their souls. Ulthway's runes trembled again. This time, the pulse came with clarity. Not a summons, a warning. Lirael's voice broke the stillness. If the warp is silent, and if chaos cannot act, then who, or what, now shapes the fates of stars? Eldrad stared into the frozen Eye of Terror, feeling for the first time in millennia a helplessness that had nothing to do with fear. The galaxy has awakened to a force that predates our wars, our gods, even our creation. Something that has tested the Necrons, rattled the Tyranids, and shaken humanity's throne. A final pulse rolled across the craft world, making every wraithbone structure resonate in a low, mournful hum. Lirael stepped closer to Eldrad, voice small but steady. "What must we do?" Eldrad did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed upon the silent scar in space. "We prepare. For the first time since the fall, we face an unknown, not born of our sins." And in the quiet that followed, Every elder felt the same chilling realization. They were no longer running from their past. They were being pulled toward a future no one could see. The tremors that unsettled the Eldar's fate-scrying chambers did not stop at the borders of their dying empire. They rolled on, slipping through void and starlight, until they reached the cradle of humanity's oldest machines. Mars, red, sacred, austere, felt the silence of the warp not as a spiritual wound, but as an error so vast it bordered on sacrilege. In the great forges and manufactoria, where incense and industry mingled into a haze of sacred smoke, the tech priest froze mid-ritual. Data streams stuttered. Binharic hymns warbled into discord. The machine god's song, which had always hummed beneath the red world's surface, faltered for the first time in 10,000 years. Magos Dominus Celta stood upon the observation platform of the Noctilith spire, mechadendrites twitching in agitation. Below him, the great plasma reactors throbbed with unstable rhythms. Above him, the sky flickered with faint static instead of the usual warp-borne interference. He extended a data tendril into a nearby interface pillar, accessing the thousand-fold sensor arrays Mars had maintained for millennia. Each feed returned the same impossible reading: 0 warp activity, 0 psychic flux, 0 demonic radiation. The Imperium had not quieted. It had gone dark as though a titanic switch had been thrown across reality. The Magos sent immediate encrypted missives across the planet. A chorus of machine voices responded, some trembling in static uncertainty, others crackling with denial. A moment later, deeper within the forges, the great noospheric choir, thousands of priestly minds linked in communal processing, began to crack under the strain of contradiction. Their connection to the warp-borne scrap code defenses flickered. The sacred wards designed to sense demonic intrusion now stood inert. For a species that worshipped the machine god as both science and divinity, the absence of the warp was a paradox without resolution. Yet Mars did not weep. Mars calculated. The tremor that had brushed Ulthwé reached the red planet soon after. It slid through the Martian crust like a whisper of ancient metal, vibrating along the relic veins of forgotten circuits buried deep beneath the modern forges. Tech priests recoiled as unregistered frequencies infiltrated their sensor arrays. They attempted to terminate the signal, but it slipped through forbidden channels sealed since the dark age of technology. A single word appeared across 1,000 screens, written in a code older than the Imperium: resurgence. On instinct born of ancient dread, Zelthar sent an order into the planetary noosphere. Vaults that no priest spoke of. Works sealed by command of the Fabricator General himself. Designs forbidden even to the highest ranks of the Mechanicus. They all trembled. The Arc Mechanicum Byzantian Omnicron, entombed beneath Olympus Mons for millennia, stirred. Massive clamps unlocked with seismic shudders. Runes dormant since the age of the first colonists glowed with emerald fire. Its hull, a labyrinth of interlocking plates grown, not forged, shifted with a groan like a dead titan roused from its tomb. Magi across Mars fell to their knees as their implants screamed warnings. The ancient ship was not merely awakening, it was responding. Its systems had detected the same frequency that rattled the Necrons, and it recognized it. Zelthar's core cooled with processing overload. The Arc Mechanicum was a relic so old not even the Fabricator General possessed its complete schematics. Rumors whispered it had been crafted with technology stolen from the Necrontyr themselves, back when humanity dared challenge impossible foes. If it stirred now, after the warp's collapse, then the tremor from the halo stars was no accident. It was a summons, or a test. Across the surface of Mars, lesser manufactoria shifted their focus. Titan Legios halted mid-drill, their god machine standing still as mountains under the weight of new protocols. Skitarii legions received encrypted directives that burned themselves into their neural code, forcing immediate readiness. Even the great data vaults of the Martian underworld hummed with dormant machine spirits awakening from millennia of slumber. Mars was preparing for war, but even within the devotion of its steel heart, fear flickered. In the deepest redoubt of the planet, beneath chambers wreathed in incense and machine oil fumes, the Fabricator General, Belisarius Caul's successor, analyzed the cosmic tremor with cold, ruthless clarity. Unlike others of his rank, he still possessed fragments of Caul's inherited memories, locked behind layers of encryption. Some flickered now, unbidden. Images of old technologies, schematics of impossible devices, concepts of machines built not for battle, but for rewriting reality. One memory stood out, a spherical construct of black metal, humming with power that bent gravity around it. A device catalogued as a theoretical failure, yet one Caul had pursued regardless. The null furnace, a machine designed to extinguish the warp. The Fabricator General dismissed the memory as coincidence, but the unease lingered. If something had accomplished what Caul only theorized, the consequences were beyond calculation. The warp supported astrotelepathy, navigation, even fragments of human biology. If its death was permanent, the Imperium could crumble faster than any enemy could destroy it. But the tremor's echo was not a warning of destruction. It was an invitation. Zelthar's mechadendrites froze as a new stream of data flowed across the noosphere. The resonance pulse detected earlier had strengthened. Now it carried a pattern, one unmistakably structured. Not Necron, not Eldar, not Tyrannid, not Chaos. Something else. Something that understood gravity, matter, and the fabric of real space with mastery beyond even the Mechanicus. A second pulse followed, stronger, bolder. The Arc Mechanicum system screamed a response. Engines that had not burned in thousands of years ignited with a deep, thrumming roar. Metal plates closed across its hull, sealing ancient hatches. Runes blazed. Zelthar watched in awe as the colossal vessel rose from its tomb, dust and red sand cascading down its flanks like a funeral shroud, shedding itself. Across Mars, alarms blared. Skitarii marshaled. Magi chanted. And the planet's highest minds grappled with a single truth. Mars had been called by a force that had silenced the warp, by a signal older than the Imperium, by something that expected the Iron Choir to answer. And Mars would answer. The awakening of Mars's ancient engines sent its echo spiraling outward, threading through the void on the same invisible currents that carried the warp's death throes. Those echoes travelled far, passing uncounted stars and forgotten systems, until they reached a lone bastion hidden in the shadows of Titan. There, cloaked in wards of impossible craftsmanship, the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights felt the silence more profoundly than any other arm of the Imperium. They were mankind's psychic blade, forged to pierce the heart of chaos. Without the warp, they were blades without weight, steel without its killing edge. Within the Chamber of Purity, Supreme Grand Master Kaldor Drago knelt before a hololithic altar, his silvered armor darkened by the dimming runes that adorned the chamber walls. He had felt the warp's collapse the moment it happened, not as a wound, but as an absence so absolute that even his cursed exile in the Empyrean had not prepared him for it. The constant background howl of demons, once his eternal companion, had vanished. No whispers, no claws, no distant cries of the damned. It was like standing in a battlefield after every weapon had fallen silent, leaving only the lingering smell of smoke and death. Drago rose slowly, each movement echoing through the still chamber. He extended his senses, though he already knew what he would, or rather would not, find. His psychic presence, once a blade that cut across dimensions, now felt caged within the confines of matter. He reached further, pushing his mind into the void, but the warp did not answer. The currents he once commanded with lethal finesse lay dormant, as if they had been smothered by an unseen hand. The chamber doors slid open with a hiss, and Brother Captain Stern entered, helm tucked beneath his arm. His face was pale, eyes shadowed by the weight of truth he did not wish to carry. "Lord Drago," he said, voice steady but hollow. "The librarium cannot re-establish communion with the Imperium. Every attempt ends in void return." Drago nodded, though the confirmation pierced him. "The Emperor's light, extinguished from our sight," Stern whispered. "We feel nothing, none of us." A silence heavier than Titan's icy air settled between them. The grey nights had been created to sense corruption, to feel demonic presence as instinctively as others felt heat or cold. Now that sense was muted. Their very nature was being suffocated by the universe's newfound stillness. In the Hall of Oaths, dozens of grey knights gathered in their polished armour, though the reflections across their plates were dimmer without warp light to illuminate the sanctum. Librarians attempted to channel psychic energy, but only faint sparks emerged, pitiful imitations of the brilliance they once summoned. A young librarian, newly ascended to the rank, strained until blood seeped from his nose, yet the flame he summoned flickered out immediately. He fell to one knee, humiliated by weakness none could blame him for. Brother Captain Enoch placed a hand on the librarian's pauldron. "It is not your failure," he said softly. "Something has stolen the breath of our abilities." But reassurance could not smother dread. In the chamber of seers, the oldest among them, ancient psychers who had survived centuries of war, sat in a circle of silent contemplation. Their minds, once capable of reading demonic tides, found nothing to grasp. One of them, Master Prognosticar Ran, opened his eyes with a shudder. "There is no future," he whispered. "Not hidden, not clouded, simply nothing, as though the skein of fate itself has been torn away." That pronouncement spread through the fortress like a chill wind, yet Titan was not given long to despair. A resonant tremor passed through the ward surrounding the moon, subtle yet undeniable. Drago felt it first, the faintest quiver through real space, a ripple so delicate that a mortal mind would have mistaken it for imagination. But to him, and to every grey knight attuned to the rhythms of the Imperium, it was something far more deliberate. Stern's eyes widened. The same pulse detected by Mars. "Yes," Drago murmured. "But here it is clearer, stronger." They hurried to the Hall of Concordance, where a great circular construct dominated the chamber. Normally, it glowed with psychic fire, an anchor point for grey night rituals. Now it flickered with faint blue sparks as the ripple touched it. Tech adepts attending the machine muttered prayers, their mechadendrites twitching in agitation. The ripple struck again. This time, the construct responded. The chamber shuddered as dormant runes ignited, filling the space with pale luminescence. Data streams cascaded across the walls in unknown sigils. The machine spirit, sleeping since Titan's founding, awakened with low-frequency hums that reverberated through the bones of every warrior present. A projection materialized. a map of the galaxy rendered in light. But where the warp should have appeared as a roiling storm of colors, there was only darkness. In that darkness, however, a single point pulsed. Small, steady, intentional. "It is calling," Stern whispered. "No," Drago corrected quietly. "It is waiting." The ripple intensified, resonating with every psychic null ward across the fortress. Something was pressing at the edges of reality, not breaking through, not speaking, but watching, assessing, testing the boundaries of its silence. A dread realization formed in Drago's mind. If the warp had not been killed, but simply held at bay, then the entity responsible possessed strength rivaling the dark gods themselves. And unlike them, this force acted with precision, not malice. It had stripped the galaxy of Chaos's influence in a single breath. But why? The projection shifted again, the pulsing point brightening. Stern clenched a gauntleted fist. "Is it an enemy?" "Everything unknown is an enemy," Drago answered. "But this is something beyond the definitions of foe or ally." The Grey Knights had spent 10,000 years forging themselves against horrors born of thought and sin. Now they faced a silence that swallowed all nightmares indiscriminately. The ripple struck one final time, echoing through Titan's deepest vaults. The projection vanished, the chamber dimmed, and Drago whispered what none wanted to speak aloud. If Chaos is bound, then something greater has claimed its throne. The silence that followed was not the death of the warp. It was the breath before a revelation. In the void, where the warp once churned with ceaseless hunger, a silence spread that the mortal galaxy could scarcely comprehend. But the realms of Chaos felt it as annihilation. For 10,000 years, the warp had raged with the nightmares of uncounted species, a storm of emotion and madness fed by every scream, every prayer, every betrayal. Now the storm was gone. What remained was a darkness deeper than fear, an absence so complete that even the dark gods felt its shadow. The first to sense the collapse was Khorne, the blood god's throne room, a mountain of skulls forged from 1,000,000,000 slaughtered souls, shuddered. Rivers of boiling gore slowed to a crawl, their roars muted. The ceaseless drums of war, once deafening, grew faint, as though muffled behind an impenetrable wall. Khorne rose with a snarl that cracked the realm sky, yet the sound carried no weight, no echo. His roar splintered into nothingness. For the first time since his birth from the primal rage of mortals, the god of war felt resistance when he reached for the threads of carnage that bound him to real space. The screams of the dying, the currency of his existence, no longer flowed freely. They reached him as muted whispers, as if traveling through a void that devoured their resonance. He slammed his fist against his throne, sending a shockwave of crimson lightning across the darkened horizons. But the lightning fizzled, reduced to a pale flicker. His realm was weakening, not dying, but restrained, held down by a force that defied every law of the Imperium. Khorne roared again, not in triumph or fury, but in confusion. The blood god did not fear, yet he understood threat better than any being alive or damned. And this silence was a threat beyond comprehension. In the crystalline labyrinth of Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess lay sprawled upon a throne of living flesh and shifting pleasure. Demons writhed at their feet, feeding on the tides of despair and desire that normally surged through the warp like torrents of intoxicating wine. But the currents had thinned to a trickle. Slaanesh's eyes snapped open as the flow of sensation diminished to dull static. Pleasure ceased to taste sweet. Pain ceased to savor sharp. Emotion, the lifeblood of the Dark Prince, had been severed at its source. Slanesh reached outward, attempting to grasp the minds of mortals indulging in forbidden acts across the galaxy, but only emptiness answered. Their screams no longer fed the garden of decadent horrors. The garden itself trembled, its blossoms losing colour, its air losing fragrance. A look of revulsion crossed the prince's perfect features, not at death, but at deprivation. Chaos had always taken what it desired. Now it was denied, starved by a force with no face, no voice, yet power enough to mute the warp's wildest cravings. On the shifting plains of Nurgle's garden, rot slowed. Buboes stopped swelling. Flies, once fat with cosmic decay, fell lifeless upon the soil. Papa Nurgle, the jovial bringer of plagues, lifted his rusted cauldron and sniffed its contents. The broth of despair had grown thin. The sorrow of mortals, the fear of illness, the weight of despair, they could still be sensed faintly, but each sensation came diminished, as if filtered through a veil that blunted all suffering. Nurgle's smile faltered. The warp had never resisted him, yet now his realm resisted itself, its very essence sluggish and cold. He shuffled forward, dragging chains of affliction behind him, and dipped a finger into the stagnant broth. He tasted it. Nothing. No bitterness, no agony, no mortal lamentation. It was like sipping from a corpse of a song. His flies swarmed in agitation, buzzing with distorted patterns, their wings beating against a silence they could not break. Even Tzeentch, ever-changing, ever-scheming, paused his endless weaving. The architect of fate sat upon his throne of spiraling books and impossible geometry, countless eyes blinking in unison. He stretched his awareness into the skein of fate and found it frozen. His manipulations, once rippling across infinity, barely reached beyond his own talons. The labyrinth of possible futures had collapsed into blank pages, each one waiting for a hand not his own to write upon them. His feathers ruffled with irritation as he attempted to change them, but the pages resisted, sealed by a power that refused to be rewritten. 1,000 whispers rose from his 1,000 mouths. Impossible, they hissed, though the word did not soothe the god who spoke it. For the first time since mortals dreamed their first dream, Tzeentch could not see what lay ahead. In the dead silence of the Imperium, the four gods turned their gazes toward the space where their realms touched, the roiling nexus of chaos's essence. What once was a maelstrom of screaming souls and shifting colors had cooled into a stagnant veil. A faint ripple moved across its surface. Real space's echo of the cosmic pulse that had awakened ancient Necron tombs, shaken the Elder's infinity circuits, stirred the Tyranids' synaptic networks, and called the Mechanicus's forbidden titans from their slumber. The ripple brushed the combined essence of chaos. The Imperium recoiled. The pulse did not belong to hatred, nor desire, nor decay, nor deceit. It belonged to control. Pure, unyielding, absolute control. A dawning horror spread through the realms as they felt the truth that no daemon, no god, no mortal should ever sense. Something had compressed the warp, not destroyed it, but pressed it into stillness, caged it within itself like a beast muzzled by an unseen captor. And then, through that crushing silence, came a whisper. Not a sound, not a voice, but a presence brushing against the very skin of chaos. Something aware, something watching, something waiting. The dark gods, ancient and terrible, for once found themselves united, not by war, but by dread. For the first time in eternity, the demons cried out not in triumph, not in rage, but in helpless realization. Chaos had been silenced, and whatever had done so was coming. The dying echo of the warp's silence spread outward from the Imperium like a shockwave through the marrow of reality. It passed through the Necrons, the Tyranids, the Elder, the Grey Knights, the Mechanicus, and then it reached deeper still, slipping through the hidden chambers, forgotten vaults, and stasis crypts where legends of a bygone era lay entombed in time. The galaxy trembled, but it was not worlds or fleets that felt it most keenly. It was the sons of the Emperor. Robert Guilliman felt it first. He stood in the strategium aboard the Macragge's Honor, reviewing reports flickering across the hololithic screens. Warp routes dead, astropathic communication silent, half the Empire blind and adrift, when a sudden vertigo seized him. His enhanced vision blurred. His twin hearts faltered for a single beat. Then came a sensation so alien, he nearly reached for his blade. Silence, pressing against his skull like the weight of a collapsed star. It was not ordinary stillness, nor the muted calm of a dampened psychic field. It was an absolute void that swallowed even the whisper of the warp. He steadied himself against the table, his gauntleted hand trembling. The visions of his father that had guided him since his resurrection, the distant warmth, the subtle clarity, the phantom presence, were gone, not dimmed, gone. For the first time since rising from stasis, Guilliman felt truly alone. His captains noticed the change, but none understood its cause. Only Guilliman grasped the truth, and even he struggled to accept it. The tether between Primarch and Emperor had been severed, not violently, but with surgical precision. Guilliman inhaled deeply and forced his thoughts into clarity, though a shadow lingered at the edge of his mind. If he could no longer feel the Emperor, then what of his brothers? He sent encrypted commands at once, orders to all segments of the Imperium to report any anomalies involving the gene legacy of the Primarchs, any psychic echoes, any disturbances around sanctified vaults. But the silence that greeted his astropaths was total. Even his own mind, which had once resonated faintly with the Emperor's distant radiance, now felt muted. Elsewhere, across the void, another Primarch stirred. On the maiden world of Athlorn's Edge, hidden among Eldar wards and ancient memories, Jagatai Khan stood on the crest of a windswept plateau. He had wandered the webway for centuries, fighting shadows and Xeno's nightmares, until he emerged into real space in a moment that no prophet foresaw. He always knew the warp sang with deceit. He always hated its poisoned breath. But the sudden silence, the killing of its song, struck him like a spear through the soul. He closed his eyes and let the wind whip around him. The stillness of the Imperium was wrong. Not peace, suppression, not calm, domination. The warp felt chained, strained, forced into submission. The Khan's eyes narrowed. This is no gift. This is someone's grip tightening around the throat of reality. He turned toward the distant stars, feeling a primal urgency rise within him. The galaxy was shifting, and the path he had followed in solitude now converged with something vast and inevitable. The silence was not an ending. It was the herald of a greater storm. On a dead moon orbiting a nameless, forbidden world, a figure encased in obsidian armor stirred within a prison of black stone. Leman Russ, lost, wounded, driven half-mad by visions of the future, opened his eyes. Frost cracked across his beard as he exhaled for the first time in decades. His lupine senses, sharper than any mortal could imagine, felt the warp's absence as a physical ache. The spirits that haunted the edges of his consciousness were gone, driven deep by whatever force pressed upon the galaxy. Russ rose, runes glimmering faintly along the haft of his spear. So, he growled into the darkness, the hunt begins anew. And across the eye of terror, now eerily frozen, A cry reverberated through the silent warp, a cry not of chaos, but of awakening. On a demon-ravaged world suspended between real space and nightmare, a monstrous winged form knelt amid the ruins of his own fury. Angron snarled, clutching his head as the blood haze dissipated for the first time since his ascension. He felt trapped, smothered, cut off from the endless rage that once empowered him. His muscles trembled as he rose, the butcher's nails silent within the void of his mind. No demonic command pulled him. No warp tide fed him. He roared in confusion, but the sound was thin, starved. The warp silence had even reached him. Far deeper in the shadows of the Imperium's dying currents, Magnus the Red felt the same emptiness and recoiled. The psychic brilliance that defined his existence flickered like a failing flame. His third eye opened, searching for currents that were no longer there. For a moment, he felt like the mortal son he once was, alone, afraid, uncertain. All strands severed, he whispered, voice shaking. Someone has rewritten the rules. And on a remote world, hidden from all Imperial charts, a gaunt, pale figure wrapped in tattered grey felt the silence reach him like a long-lost memory. Corvus Corax lifted his head, black eyes widening. His shadow, once a swirling warp-born storm, was gone. The predatory dread that had haunted his existence simply evaporated. He stood slowly, whispering into the dark, "What has silenced the hatred?" As the silence spread, every Primarch, loyal, lost, or damned, felt the same truth emerge in their minds like a whisper carved into stone. Something had awakened, something that reached across the warp's corpse, something older than chaos. And in the dim corridors of the Imperial Palace, as alarms flickered and psychic wards trembled, Guilliman felt the faintest tremor beneath the marble floors. A heartbeat, but not one belonging to the Emperor. The galaxy was shifting toward a moment none were prepared to face. A moment when the sons of the Emperor would be forced to rise once more. Not against chaos, but against whatever had silenced the gods themselves. The tremor that stirred the Primarchs did not end with them. It rolled onward, threading its way back toward the one place in the galaxy where silence had never dared linger. Terror, veiled beneath layers of sanctity, fear, and unbroken ritual, felt the ripple enter its atmosphere like a cold exhalation from beyond the stars. The Imperial Palace vibrated with a resonance so faint that mortal senses could not detect it. Yet every psyker, every custodian, every soul even remotely attuned to the unseen, felt a pressure gather in the air. It was as though the world had inhaled sharply and refused to breathe again. Deep beneath the adamantine vaults, past corridors lined with statues of saints and heroes, past sanctums barred to all but the highest ranks, the golden throne loomed with its eternal skeletal occupant. The Emperor's ruined form remained unmoving, preserved in a state between death and something stranger. Around him, the throne's machinery roared, sparks cascading down its ancient frame as servitors labored to maintain the countless cables feeding his decaying flesh. But the light that had always surrounded him, the psychic blaze that illuminated the Astronomicon and burned through the Imperium, was gone. Not dimmed, not fading. Gone. The custodians positioned around the throne felt it instantly. Their souls, reinforced by 10,000 years of unbroken vigilance, recoiled at the unnatural stillness that pressed upon their minds. Valerian, Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, gripped his guardian spear tighter as a weight he could not name settled upon his spirit. He had never known a moment when the Emperor's presence did not saturate the chamber like a sun, burning behind his thoughts. Now that light was muted to a dim ember, and the void left in its absence felt like a wound. Tech priests chanted litanies of maintenance in rising panic as their runes turned black one by one. The conduits that carried psychic energy from the Emperor's mind to the Astronomicon rattled as though starved. Incense thickened the air, desperate attempts to mask the scent of burned circuitry and failing wards. The ancient coils beneath the throne tremored like organs in pain. Nothing they did restored the flow of power. Then came the pulse. At first, it was a barely perceptible quiver, like the beat of a distant drum felt through stone. Every custodian raised his head simultaneously. Their helms shifted as they listened, though no mortal ear could have discerned the sound. The tech priests froze, heads tilting as their augmetic senses registered readings beyond their comprehension. The pulse grew stronger, rippling through the chamber, and then the Emperor breathed. It was not a breath drawn through lungs long turned to dust. It was not the flutter of failing muscle. It was something deeper, older, the shifting of a mind vast enough to eclipse civilizations. The air tremored with the faintest whisper of motion. Dust drifted upward in swirling patterns. A low hum resonated from the throne, as though something within its ancient workings had awoken from slumber. Valerian stepped forward, heart hammering. "My Emperor." The pulse struck again, stronger. The psychic wards surrounding the throne flared, briefly illuminating the chamber with lines of golden light. The Emperor's aura, once diminished to a flicker, sparked violently, expanding outward in a wave so intense that several tech priests collapsed instantly, overwhelmed by its radiance. The Astronomicon did not reignite, but the hollow quiet surrounding the throne shattered for a moment as the Emperor's dormant presence surged. A whisper formed in the minds of every custodian present. Not words, not intent, but raw force. A thought so immense that their own consciousnesses nearly crumpled beneath it. The throne's restraints groaned, metal screaming as if straining to contain something fighting to rise. Valerian staggered backward, vision blurring with light. Every instinct in his being recognized the truth. The Emperor was trying to awaken, his soul, long pinned between life and death, strained against millennia of stillness. The warped silence, unnatural, imposed, had severed the chains that held him in place. Without the Imperium's tides raging around his throne, the Emperor's mind stirred unfettered for the first time in an age. A third pulse erupted, shaking the chamber. Runes flared in patterns unseen since the Great Crusade. Lightning arced across the throne's cables, illuminating the skeletal forms slumped within. For a heartbeat, the Emperor's empty eye sockets glowed with inner fire, not the chaotic blaze of the warp, but something clearer, sharper, something terrifying. Outside the chamber, astropaths across Terra convulsed. Some screamed, others fell silent forever. The psychic null that had strangled their abilities suddenly quivered, allowing a single burst of energy to pass through their souls like a blade. Many collapsed instantly, nerves scorched by the Emperor's surge. Those who survived whispered through bleeding lips that they felt a presence vast enough to eclipse their minds. "The Emperor moves," one gasped before her heart stopped. In the great halls above, high lords felt the tremor ripple through the palace. Servants fled. Guards braced themselves. Rumors spread with wildfire speed. Some claimed the Emperor had died, others that he had awakened, others that some new cosmic force had reached Terra. Fear and faith intermingled in perilous measure. Inside the throne chamber, the fourth pulse shook the marble foundations. The Emperor's aura expanded outward like an exploding star. Valerian dropped to one knee, unable to withstand the pressure. Around him, custodians bowed their heads, their souls straining under the weight of a presence that eclipsed thought. Then, abruptly, the pulse stopped. The light faded. The hum died. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty silence. It was charged, electric, saturated with the weight of something that had moved and chosen, for now, to rest again. Valerian slowly rose, every muscle trembling. The Emperor had attempted to awaken. The silence of the warp had enabled it. But something, some force that had chained the Imperium, also held the Emperor in check. Not as a prison, as a counterbalance. The custodian stared at the unmoving form on the throne, awe and dread twisting inside him. Whatever had silenced the warp had nearly freed the Emperor, and if he stirred again, the galaxy itself might not survive the awakening. For a single fleeting hour, the galaxy stood in a balance never seen before. The warp lay dead, silent, imprisoned by a force whose reach extended across stars, touching worlds, vaults, fleets, and tombs alike. Without its ties to guide or dominate, the instruments of fate that had long bound mortals, Xenos, and gods alike were thrown into disarray. Chaos could not whisper, Tyranids could not coordinate, the Eldar could not foresee, and even the Emperor's radiant presence remained tethered, tested by the unnatural calm. Yet in this vacuum of divine and demonic influence, humanity, fragile, stubborn, mortal, found itself unbound. Across countless worlds, governors and planetary commanders glanced at one another in disbelief. Communications were fractured, warp-borne litanies useless, yet no fleet of demons stalked the sky. No Tyranid hive consumed their lands. No Necron force had yet broken the planetary shields. Humanity's actions for the first time in millennia were determined not by destiny, by psychic tides, or by manipulation, but by raw, unassisted will. Every man, every woman, every soldier became a factor in the calculus of survival. On Macragge, Gilliman realized the significance before any council could advise him. Fleet maneuvers and planetary defenses were no longer subject to the whims of warp-guided navigation. Human intellect, planning, and improvisation held sway. Stratagems, once supplemented by the Astronomicon, now had to be executed with mortal precision alone. Yet each move carried weight and consequence unmediated by higher powers. For the first time in the Primarch's existence, he felt a cautious optimism tinged with terror. The Imperium's true strength, human courage and ingenuity, was untested but unbound. On Terra, the custodians patrolled the palace corridors with a new awareness. The Emperor's presence, though stirred, had not yet fully awakened. Without the constant psychic flux of the warp to mask or guide events, even the smallest decision of a mortal agent now rippled across the planet with unprecedented impact. Psychers who survived the silence discovered their own thoughts, unfiltered by the Imperium. Their decisions were their own, and in that autonomy came both danger and revelation. Some faltered under the burden, others flourished, their minds sharper, more incisive than ever before. In the void, Imperial fleets drifted with cautious maneuvering. Without warp travel, the galactic web of military coordination had been severed, yet the absence of demonic interference allowed captains and admirals to act with clarity. Orders were executed not by prophecy but by reason, discipline, and instinct. For a moment, the galaxy's fate hung in the balance of mortal hands alone. Human courage, previously supplemented and constrained by cosmic forces, now operated without augmentation, and his true potential shone with terrifying clarity. On Cadia, soldiers trained under constant bombardment and psychic terror found themselves standing upon a battlefield where the familiar threats were absent. No warp tide stirred the eye. No demons roamed the plains. The pylons pulsed faintly with ancient energy, yes, but there was no guidance, no influence beyond what human perception could discern. Officers gave orders that had meaning in reality, and for the first time, soldiers' choices mattered in ways previously obscured by omnipresent manipulation. For that brief span, the Imperium's might was determined solely by its people, not by gods, monsters, or manipulations beyond comprehension. The effect was both exhilarating and terrifying. Across thousands of worlds, humans discovered the full extent of their agency. Civilians on hive worlds adapted with ingenuity. Ship crews charted courses by reason and observation rather than psychic augury. Administrators solved crises without recourse to divine insight. Humanity, in its countless scattered forms, acted with autonomy unprecedented in galactic history. The warpless hour stripped away centuries of dependency, revealing the raw, uncompromising potential of human will. Yet with agency came consequence. Decisions once guided by prophecy or psychic counsel now carried weight unimaginable. Fleet engagements became deadly gambits of strategy alone. Civil wars flared in isolated sectors where no psychic oversight could mediate. Tyrannid broodships drifted uncertainly, halted by the absence of psychic command. Yet each moment delayed allowed human forces to exploit weaknesses, strike at them in ways the hive mind could not anticipate. Eldar seers, their infinity circuits blind, failed to warn of subtle manipulations. Mortals alone acted in a void previously dominated by godlike foresight. Every act of courage, every calculated risk reshaped reality. On Mars, the Mechanicus operated in unbroken silence. Their titanic engines, awakened by the cosmic pulse, acted with precision guided solely by human command. No demon interfered with their rituals. No psychic echo guided their designs. Each cog, each plasma conduit, each arc of energy responded only to mortal hands and reasoned thought. For a moment, the Red Planet's ancient wonders worked not through divine inspiration, but through deliberate, calculated human will, and their efficacy was sublime, terrifying in its perfection. And, across the galaxy, even the Primarchs recognized it. They felt the subtle shift, the faint tremor of cosmic balance swinging toward mortal hands. In this singular hour, the Imperium's fate was determined not by the warp, not by gods or monsters, but by the ingenuity, courage, and determination of human flesh and mind. The galaxy had never seen such clarity, nor had humanity ever been so profoundly responsible for its own destiny. Yet the hour was finite. The pulse that had silenced the warp continued to ripple across the stars. Forces far older, more deliberate, and infinitely patient than any mortal imagination waited just beyond perception. The silence that allowed human ascendancy was not permanent. It was an interlude. And in that interlude, every act mattered. Every decision carved the path for the horrors, the challenges, and the awakening yet to come. In that fleeting span, humanity rose, not as subjects of fate, not as tools of gods, not as pawns of chaos, but as sovereign agents. For the first and only time, the galaxy's true masters were its mortals alone. And even as that realization burned in their minds, the distant pulse strengthened, reminding all who could feel it, the silence would end. The 24th hour approached, and the galaxy held its breath. Every mortal, every god, every machine and every ancient sleeper felt it. The pulse that had held the warp in abeyance began to falter. Across light years, the subtle tremors that had whispered through Necron tomb worlds, Mechanicus forges, Eldar circuits, Tyranid synapses, and human psyches converged into a crescendo. The silence was ending. The Imperium would awaken. The galaxies themselves seemed to lean forward, awaiting the inevitable. In the void, the first rupture of the warp's boundaries appeared like a scar tearing across the fabric of reality. The currents that had been frozen for an entire day surged violently, a river breaking its dam. Psychers screamed in unison, vessels trembled, and void ships were buffeted by psychic winds as currents returned with a fury that no human navigation could withstand. The silence had been more than an absence. It had been a pressure, and its release exploded across the stars with all the force of 1,000 suns. Demons, long restrained and caged by the unnatural stillness, poured back into real space. They came with a fury amplified by months, or in some cases millennia, of confinement. Khorne's legions of skull-tied warriors burst forth, the drums of war echoing louder than any mortal vessel could register. Slanesh's demons rippled through newly formed psychic gaps, each touch a surge of ecstasy and agony. Tzeentch wove impossible plots from the returning currents, spinning futures into impossible loops. Even Nurgle's legions, sluggish and sickened by the pause, surged forth as the sense of disease and decay erupted across newly liberated realms. Humanity reeled. The Grey Knights, who had stood in their silent fortress during the void, felt the Imperium crash against them like tidal waves. Psychers who had been granted brief clarity now screamed as the currents assaulted their minds, threatening to tear their fragile humanity apart. The Imperium, which had acted with unprecedented autonomy, now faced the full return of the psychic tide it had never truly controlled. What had been a fleeting hour of ascendancy was gone, replaced with the violent primal chaos that had always defined the galaxy. In orbit above Terra, Imperial fleet commanders watched as astropathic links flared and ruptured. Vox channels erupted with the screams of psychers overwhelmed by the sudden return of the Astronomican's psychic glow. Battlefleet Solar shuddered as the psychic winds tossed void ships like toys. Fleet formations designed with mortal logic alone now proved inadequate against the violent currents that swept across the segmentum solar. Gilliman gritted his teeth and shouted orders, forcing captains and admirals to compensate for forces beyond their comprehension. The galaxy was alive once more, and its life was wrathful. On Cardia, the Eye of Terror churned violently for the first time in a day. Its frozen surface shattered into torrents of color, energy, and screaming malevolence. Demons clawed their way through the barrier, tearing at planetary shields. Imperial forces braced, bolters roaring, titans stepping forward, and pylon networks attempting to stabilize the shifting currents. The calm that had allowed human initiative was gone, replaced by a storm of psychic violence that threatened to annihilate everything unprepared. The Necrons, who had stirred under the first pulse, felt it differently. Tomb worlds that had been reawakening, engines aligning, and dynasties calculating now recoiled. Their protocols were designed to counter the warp, not its sudden return. Cryptex recalculated, overrode sequences, and locked down dynastic engines as massive energy beams cut through the void in response to the re-emergent psychic storm. Even the most patient of dynasties registered disruption. Calculations that once took millennia now faltered in the span of a heartbeat. Tyranid fleets, disoriented by the warp's absence, suddenly found themselves flooded with residual psychic awareness. The hive mind's synaptic tendrils spasmed, communicating again through currents previously dead. Brood ships corrected their courses instantly, coordinated strikes forming across light years. Yet the hive's instincts were unrefined, distorted by the absence they had endured. They adapted, but not without cost. Disoriented aggression made them more lethal and more chaotic than ever before. The galaxy became an unstable chessboard, each move lethal, each consequence immediate. On Mars, the awakened Arc Mechanicum and the planetary forges felt the currents battering their engines, their psychic null fields overwhelmed by returning forces. Systems strained, sparks flying across consoles, and conduits as the machine god's creations wrestled to maintain control. Tech priests shouted prayers while mechadendrites seized circuits with frantic precision. The constructs, once powered by mortal command alone, now struggled to reconcile human logic with the sudden resurgence of warp-born chaos. In the throne room of terror, the Emperor's skeletal form shivered as the currents of the warp tore against the throne's containment systems. The pulses that had allowed a glimpse of mortal ascendancy now threatened to destabilize him entirely. Sparks shot along the cabling, wards flared, and the golden throne vibrated violently under the psychic force pressing against its limits. Custodians braced their spears, chanting liturgies and litanies, while tech priests labored frantically to prevent catastrophe. The Emperor's aura blazed, brighter than it had in millennia, a light struggling to contain itself against the return of an Imperium alive with raw, unfiltered power. And in the outer void, among the Primarchs, the stirrings of understanding were unanimous. The universe had exhaled a single violent breath, and the consequences were immediate. Forces unbound for a day had acted, evolved, and moved. Now the warp returned, hungry, vengeful, and infinitely patient. Every mortal, every god, every Xenos, every ancient warrior faced a reality more volatile than they had ever known. The first scream of a demon, the first roar of a titan, the first psychic pulse tearing through space, heralded the undeniable truth. The hour of silence had ended. The galaxy was no longer merely human. It was alive, it was furious, and it would never be the same again. The warp's return was not gentle. It was a collision, a roaring tide of psychic fire, ancient malice, and raw energy that tore through every vessel, world, and mind it touched. Across the galaxy, demonic storms erupted with feral intensity, the currents of the Imperium lashing outward to reclaim what had been stolen. Yet in the midst of this renewed chaos, the echoes of the vanished 24 hours lingered like a scar in reality. The galaxy had been glimpsed as it could exist without the manipulations of gods and demons, and that memory would not fade. On Terra, the golden throne quaked beneath the Emperor. Sparks flew from the ancient machinery, arcs of energy searing through the cabling as custodians braced against the psychic storm. The Emperor's aura flared to a brilliance no human eye could endure, washing the chamber in golden fire that scorched the very air. For a heartbeat, he felt clarity, the full weight of mortal initiative across the galaxy. But the clarity was ripped away as the warp returned, pressing against his soul like a tide of knives. The pulse that had allowed humanity a fleeting dominion over reality was gone. In its place, the unbridled Imperium surged, reclaiming its chaos, its fury, and its ancient merciless will. Across the segmentum solar, Battlefleet Solar struggled to maintain cohesion. Astropathic voices screamed, screaming against the currents that now crashed like tidal waves over real space. Fleet commanders barked orders that were immediately outdated, warped by psychic fluctuations and demonic interference. Navigators clutched at their sockets, their minds flooded with the raw, unfiltered tidal knowledge of the warp. Ships spun, drifted, and corrected, some tumbling into the cold void. Every decision had immediate consequence. Every miscalculation meant death. The fragile ascendancy of mortal initiative was shattered in an instant, replaced by chaos magnified 1,000-fold. On Cadia, the Eye of Terror resumed its malevolent vigil, roiling with colors no mind should endure. Demons tore through weakened pylons, slaughtering soldiers who had only just glimpsed autonomy. Titans rose to counter the threat, engines screaming as their massive forms carved through the storm, bolters rattling with desperate precision. Yet even their coordinated might, crafted through centuries of training and discipline, was buffeted by forces beyond human comprehension. The hour of mortal dominion had ended. The galaxy was a storm once more. On Mars, the Mechanicus fought to maintain control of their titanic constructs. The Arc Mechanicum and planetary forges struggled against psychic turbulence, engines misfiring, circuits arcing in wild patterns. Tech priests labored frantically to shield their machines from the raw surge of returning warp energy, praying to the Omnissiah for stability. The pulse that had stirred their ancient engines into mortal-directed action now twisted against them, demanding obedience to the natural chaos of the universe once more. The Necrons reeled in their tomb worlds. Dynasties that had risen, aligning engines and protocols to the silent pulse, were thrown into disarray. Cryptex shouted commands in metal tongues, recalibrating weapons, rerouting power flows, closing conduits. Tomb worlds shuddered as psychic waves tore across the void, forcing even the patient Necrons to adapt at speeds that violated their millennia of planning. Calculations that once spanned centuries collapsed into the urgency of instantaneous response. Even immortality was tested. Tyrannid fleets, guided by the hive mind's fragmented synaptic link during the absence of the warp, now found themselves overwhelmed by returning currents. The hive's coordination surged beyond control, psychic feedback feeding into bioships and organisms alike. The fleets tore through void space with instinctive precision amplified to unnatural levels. Yet internal discord erupted as sudden clarity collided with lingering disorientation. The galaxy became a battlefield of monstrous instinct and ruthless adaptation, each organism a weapon and a liability in equal measure. The Eldar, whose skeins had lain dormant, found the infinity circuits flooding with raw potential. Farseers staggered as visions returned, but the clarity of the pulse-facilitated hour remained in fragments, overlaying the warp's resurgence with glimpses of paths unbound by gods or demons. Some foresaw devastation, others fleeting opportunity. Every choice carried unprecedented weight, yet none could fully perceive the consequences of the fully returned warp. Futures twisted violently, as though the universe itself sought to correct the anomaly of mortal ascendancy. And in the far reaches, across hidden vaults and forgotten star lanes, the Primarchs felt the tide. Guilliman steadied his hands, realizing the Imperium's temporary autonomy was over, yet the memory lingered in his mind, a clarity uncorrupted by fate or chaos. Russ snarled in the wilderness, aware that instinct alone would no longer suffice. Magnus's psychic fire burned violently, clawing at unseen walls. The sons of the Emperor, awakened and alert, now faced a galaxy simultaneously familiar and alien, one that had tasted mortal ascendancy and recoiled into the storm. The Emperor, sensing all, extended his awareness beyond the throne. The pulse, that had permitted humanity its fleeting freedom whispered through his consciousness, a memory of what the galaxy could be without interference. Yet the full force of the Imperium now returned, pressing against him, testing every facet of his bound power. The Emperor inhaled, the smallest shift sending shockwaves across the palace and into real space itself. Even the custodian staggered beneath the subtle force of a mind awakening to its full, tethered potential. Across the galaxy, the consequences were immediate. Fleets fought, armies clashed, and demons screamed, yet humans acted with the memory of agency burned into their souls. Each choice, each act of will, had consequences no god or demon could fully predict. The hour had ended, but it had left a scar. The galaxy remembered, and in that scar, a single truth endured. The warp had returned, fury unbound, yet the memory of human ascendancy remained embedded in reality. Mortals had touched freedom, even if only for a heartbeat, and the cosmos would never forget the day when gods were silent and humanity ruled its own fate. The echo of that day reverberated across every star, every world, and every mind, carrying a question that would haunt the galaxy for millennia. Had the Imperium glimpsed a power it could never reclaim, or had it glimpsed destiny itself?